Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. Hello everyone, welcome to Healing the Spirit. Before we get into the episode today, I just want to let all of you know about a new offering that I'm creating. It's called Shapeshifting Academy, and it's a deep dive into the mutable signs in astrology, which are Sagittarius, Virgo, Pisces, and Gemini, as well as their traditional rulers, Mercury and Jupiter. It's all about learning how to find flexibility and flow and how to pivot when we're feeling stuck in our relationships, in our creative work, and in life. And it's a course that has been in the making since, since I was born. That's what it feels like since I was born with my sun, moon, rising in mutable signs. And anyways, I'll be talking more about this on the podcast and in various places like my newsletter, my Instagram over the coming month. But we're starting on Thursday, October 3rd, 2024. And I've created a really beautiful, a super fun landing page that I'm really proud of and I spent a lot of time on. And so, I just invite you to check it out at this time. Links will be below, and I really hope you'll consider joining us if it's calling to you. Okay, so onwards to today's episode. Today, I have a friend of the podcast and someone whose work I admire so deeply, Xenia Viray. Xenia has been on the podcast before. I believe it was episode 156, released this past June, and we discussed the idea of cosmologies beyond binaries. And the moment that we wrapped up that last conversation, I just knew that we'll be having her on again because there was so much to talk about with Xenia. She's one of those people that has this incredible ability to both bring abstract feelings and thoughts into words that are poetic, expansive, and healing, and also has such an incredible ability to bring together concepts that are seemingly on paper quite far-fetched. Her work has nourished me so deeply in the past couple years that I've known her, and it's helped me open up my imaginative faculties in terms of what's possible for creating art that heals and doing healing work that feels life-giving and feels honoring to my creative forces. So in this conversation, Xenia and I discussed some very juicy topics. Again, these topics feel like they're kind of far apart from one another, but somehow just beautifully comes together in this conversation. We talked about the idea of cult in culture, how normative behaviors within small groups can create waves of change, but also create a hive mind. We discussed the idea of imagination monopoly, a term that Xenia has been thinking a lot about and writing about. We talked about the circuits in human design, which are the individual, tribe, and collective circuits as frameworks for understanding ourselves. And we also discussed what it means to be a visionary and to experience being misunderstood and illegible to some people as we stay true to who we are on a deeper, essential level. I was also pleasantly surprised that this time what emerged within this conversation space was Xenia and I sharing a lot about our personal experiences and our respective walks of life and the ways that our experiences kind of intersect and also differ from one another. We also discussed Xenia's upcoming offering, Create Your Cosmology, which will begin on Tuesday, September 24th, 2024. And I want to introduce this offering to you by reading some of what Xenia wrote on the landing page of the course, because I took this course last year and it was so impactful and really shifted the way that I operated within my spirituality. It gave me a sense of clarity about the path that I'm walking and also who I am and what I'm here to do. And I really want to share this with all of you in case it resonates with you and Xenia's voice resonates with you. So this is what she wrote about Create Your Cosmology. Create Your Cosmology is a 9-week hybrid experience centered around exploring the question of who interprets your reality so you can become the authority of your life, have agency in your reality creation, express your unique truth, and attract those who resonate with it. It's a course that's designed for original creatives, nuanced thinkers, and sensitive Imagineers who want to be the creative director of their belief systems and express their truth with confidence and compassion. Part magical vortex, part research project, and part creative practice, this course weaves together your intellectual, creative, and spiritual ways of knowing to give you a more connected, cohesive, and confident pathway to authentically being who you are in the world. It's so beautiful. Like, I get chills just reading that. I also want to let you know that this year I will be contributing a guest workshop to Xenia's course. It's titled The Art of Cosmic Conversations, and we'll be diving deeper into what it means to create your own practice of being in conversations with the planets, whether you consider yourself a practicing astrologer or not, or if you maybe just want to have relationships with different planets, which is absolutely accessible to, I believe, everyone. If you join Create Your Cosmology before September 14th, which is basically at the end of this week, you will be receiving one additional one-on-one session with Xenia, which, in my opinion, as someone who has worked with her in sessions, is truly, truly invaluable. Okay, without further ado, here is my conversation with Xenia Viray. Welcome again, Xenia. Thank you for being here. I am so excited to have you. I knew that once we were done with the conversation last time, which I kind of had to cut off because I was like, okay, I think we we can talk for 4 hours. I just knew that I would want to have you back, and so it's so exciting to have you back. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I love that conversation, and I'm really, really excited to be here again.
Yeah, me too. So I usually ask my guests to introduce themselves with a question that I realized I didn't ask you last time, which is, who do you feel, sense, or know yourself to be in this present moment?
Oh, wow. Okay. In this present moment, I know myself to be, and this is very interesting. I'm surprised by this. Like a spider. That's like a
Ah,
someone weaving something.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I love that imagery. Yeah. Um, I wanted to have you on today, Xenia, because I was a participant in Create Your Cosmology the last time you ran it. And it was such an incredible experience. I think part of what made it so incredible to me was also because that was the first time I was in a course with you. So
Mm.
I was introduced to your way of holding space and facilitating and sharing your may I say, creative genius with all of us. And it was just so, I remember how opening it felt. And, you know, I was thinking about that first round of Create Your Cosmology. And it felt like such a tender time for me because right in the middle of that course, my grandpa passed away. And I have
Mm,
this really beautiful relationship with my maternal grandmother and my maternal grandfather, who are both Pisces suns like me. So there's something there about your course coming in around the time that, if I remember correctly, Pluto was just entering Aquarius at that time, or like Saturn was entering Pisces. Like it was one of those transits, and it just felt like arriving into a new land astrologically, and then being in this experience with you, and yeah, kind of almost like rebirthing myself is how I think about that time. So I'm so excited to hear that you decided to run this offering again, and yeah, I just want to start there actually, because I know you have a backstory to um, create your cosmology that feels really exciting to share in this moment. So
mm.
yeah, I'm curious if you want to speak more to that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you for sharing your experience and also what you were personally going through at the time of Create Your Cosmology. I do think it was when Pluto was moving into Aquarius.
Yeah,
If I think that's when it came
yeah,
out. Um, I was developing that course for 2 to 3 years,
hmm
and I created it specifically because in the time of 2020, I started to way more deeply connect to my inner voice and my inner self, largely because I stopped working 1,000 jobs at the same time and I could actually have the space to hear and feel who I really am.
mm
But during that time, as I was opening to so many potentials and possibilities, I was also getting lost in the sea of information and
mm
really strong opinions in the spiritual world, about the public health crisis,
mhm,
about race relations, about
mhm,
everything, such strong opinions. And I was really getting clear on this habit I had from a very young age of trying to find the right authority or
mm
person to learn from and searching for that teacher
mm
and constantly being reminded that I was never going to escape the vulnerability of being a human being, which is that we can't know everything, that we're not designed to know everything, and not everything is knowable.
yeah,
And I started to look into the mysteries of existence by asking really foundational questions. So instead of asking what is the best news source, I started asking myself, what is reality? What is the truth? What is
mm
knowledge? What is a relationship? What is a community? What is objectivity? And as I went deep into that sort of personal research project, I realized that my orientation towards truth or looking for a teacher or looking for knowledge was based on so many assumptions that aren't my assumptions.
mhm,
Assumptions about like what intelligence means, what legitimacy means, what institutions to trust, or even needing an institution to tap
mm
to what's right for you.
yeah,
And I it was such a painful thing to realize that I was going to have to give up this sort of search for like an all-knowing teacher or a body of knowledge. And I was going to have to tap into an inner compass and accept that truth is really complicated and nuanced and multidimensional and personal.
mm
And I think that during the time of misinformation and disinformation, we can forget about the part of truth that is just inherently different for us on different days and depending on who we are and our lived experience. And
yeah,
so, Create Your Cosmology took that whole sort of painful transmutation from feeling lost and the grief of realizing I'm never going to find this thing I'm looking for. And then realizing, well, if I can't find something, what I can do is create something and better understand something.
Mm.
And I I worked really hard to basically create the experience I wish that I had
Mm.
before I went to college, before I learned anything about any spiritual or esoteric knowledge,
Yeah.
before I even got curious about science, like researching science as a sort of personal hobby. This is the
Mm.
work I wish happened to prepare my imagination and psyche to orient myself in the world of truth and information.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow, that's beautiful. I'm curious to hear you speak more about what you mean by cosmology. How do you understand that word? Um, yeah, I just feel like you have something really interesting to say about this.
Well, it's really curious because when you hear the word cosmology, you're mostly going to be hearing from people who are talking about specific mythological, ancient, or indigenous worldviews and how people organize the world according to their spiritual belief system or their ancient belief system. Or you're going to hear about astronomers and physicists who study the nature of the universe on a very advanced mathematical level. Those are
Hmm.
the two most prominent uses of the word cosmology. But I relate to the word cosmology as our foundational and holistic understanding of reality. And when you're studying another culture, it's clear that there's sort of belief systems and opinions embedded in the way they relate to reality, right? Because
Yeah.
it's not our culture.
Yeah.
But I started to realize that no matter who you are living in a cosmology. You are
Mm.
living in a pre-imagined set of constructs and ideas.
Yeah.
And it's not talked about often because it's the water we swim in. We're not meant to perceive it. It's underneath everything.
Yeah.
And because I'm super multidisciplinary, cosmology appealed to me because it has to tie everything together.
Mm.
And I just have a sort of subjective sense that all things must interconnect and that constructing the world from a sort of spiritual view that disconnects from our scientific view, that then has nothing to do with like the way we organize ourselves politically, you know, that seems like a way of fracturing ourselves and our minds and
Mm.
each other. So to me,
Mhm.
cosmology was the opposite of that fractured
Mm.
existence.
Yeah. Yeah. As you're explaining it, I'm thinking about what a beautiful choice of terminology, because you could have chosen like worldview, or you could have chosen like perspective, right? Like create your perspective is like maybe a more yeah, like something that feels maybe less nebulous. I think cosmology, I mean, I personally find myself so drawn to that word because it does recognize that we are part of the cosmos, in ways that maybe like a perspective doesn't, right? A perspective is just kind of like, you know, like kind of short and small. And I think there's kind of a largeness to the invitation that you're putting out with this offering. Um, I I'm curious to just start diving deep into some of the topics that you brought into our conversation, Xenia, because you said something in an email exchange that we had about the cult and culture, and I think this is all obviously connected to cosmology, right? But yeah, I'm curious to hear you talk more about this, and outside of the container of this conversation, you and I have also spoken a lot about this idea of, What does it mean to, for example, be into astrology or be into tarot when there's literally like a gazillion books, right, on the topic? And there are all these, even within this very niche kind of world that we operate in, that we swim in, right, in the quote unquote spiritual world, there's so many different communities with so many different perspectives. And yeah, I'm curious to explore this with you because I think so much of the way we think and the way that we use knowledge is really connected to what we see other people doing because we're just very social creatures, right? And so, yeah, I'm going to pause there and see what comes up for you.
Yeah, I was just thinking a lot about how the word, cult is very literally in culture
Hmm.
and how so many of the people that are not inside my sort of spiritual community who watch some of the work I'm doing are wondering with almost everything I do, like, is that a cult? Are you in a cult? And it is really difficult to explain different sort of energetic social landscapes that are creating their own normative behaviors or alternative
Mm.
norms from the mainstream. But
Yeah.
what I notice is that we have a tendency to either overly formalize the rules of behavior in groups of people to sort of try to protect ourselves, which I think is usually done with a really positive intention,
Mm.
of creating like a communication protocol or,
Hmm.
some kind of way to keep the relational dynamics really clean and above board. But the reality is, like, human beings mostly perceive information unconsciously. There's like a
Hmm.
wild amount in the difference between what we can consciously perceive and what is unconsciously perceived.
Yeah.
And so I noticed that because of that, a lot of times unconscious behaviors are guiding spaces and dynamics and relationships, and we're often opting into them not only before we talk about them, but without anybody really realizing or noticing what the assumptions are inside a group
Mm. Hmm.
about you know how much you're expected to participate. I think about this a lot, and this is probably feels a little bit of a surprise way of thinking about this, but I'm often irked by when I'm watching pop culture, TV, movies, when people talk about like somebody being a bad friend.
Mm. Hmm.
Get really irked about this concept of being a bad friend
Yeah.
because we all need different things at different times.
Yeah.
And there's such this concept of like bad teacher, good student, bad student, kind person. And there's so much assumption
Yeah.
about us being the same and
Mm.
us needing the same things.
Hmm.
And there's such an assumption that we will keep each other safe or be better to each other if we all go along with assuming that we are the same.
Mm.
And in our culture, it's some pretty obvious things. Like I used to write a lot of nonfiction or a lot of fiction, a lot of short stories, and I would often start describing my characters based on like where they work, what they're wearing, and the coffee shop they hang out at, because that's how we identify things in our culture, because
Yeah.
that's the water we swim in.
Yeah.
So yeah, it just culture is a cult. That phrase just reminds me of how when you question something that's in the daily existence of the people around you, it's so jarring that
Mm.
people are really uncomfortable with it.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I was actually checking the tagline of your Substack. And if I remember correctly, you said something about like healers who create and artists who heal or something like that. Um, some variation of that phrasing, and that really caught my attention because it's making me think about how, for me, having come from this more conventional artistic background, I do notice that artists in general, like when I'm talking about artists, I'm talking about really the conventional world of musicians, writers, poets. There is this uh, romanticizing suffering kind of thing that we really like to do. It's like, yeah, the creation is just really hard, making art is really hard. And it's like we're never paid enough. And then when I get into more of the spirituality and like healing world, the first thing I encountered was actually the opposite of that. It's almost like in order for something to be spiritual, it has to be so easeful. Like there can be no problems whatsoever, right? And if you think bad thoughts, like you need to wash them with white light. And I think it's just so interesting because the two worlds to me are um like almost bowing to completely different ideals or like bowing to completely different gods. One is like it's like the over glorification of like the Eight of Pentacles in the tarot versus um like the Ace of Cups, or something like that. There's kind of yeah, it's really interesting to see how we relate to our disciplines based on what we see other people doing. And a lot of it, as you mentioned, is unconscious or subconscious. So what have you found in your exploration and also to kind of place us within a timeline, right? Since the first time you ran Create Your Cosmology, I've noticed you start using this term to describe what you do, which is imagination healer, which I think is I'm really curious to hear about where they kind of come together. Where do you think imagination healing is necessary, or either necessary to create one's cosmology, or how creating our cosmology helps us heal our imagination?
Mm. First of all, you said so many really interesting, beautiful things that like I have so much I want to respond to. But I'll start sort of with this idea of imagination healing because, you
Mhm.
know, I realize that something this healer Angela Angel said to me a while ago, it took me 6 or 7 years to unravel, was that you don't find a career, you become a career. You become that frequency. You become that
Mm.
frequency, and then what your work in the world does will change. And of course, this was during a reading where I was like, I need help with my career. Please help me. um, and everything I've done since then has taught me that for certain people, the resonance that you're already born with is your life's work, is your career, is your contribution. And Create Your Cosmology was the process of me taking all of the structures that had sort of crystallized or become hard. I think about it like rocks and soil,
Mhm.
and we're making it really hard to plant anything that was my
Mm.
own. And so through the course, we look at the things that seem certain and we kind of very gently, playfully, and sometimes, in more intense ways, watch those things dissolve. Like
Mhm.
suddenly there are no walls. And you think that sounds like freedom, but our nervous systems aren't trained to feel happy in that environment without a lot of walls and a lot of structure. So,
Mhm.
Create Your Cosmology is actually making fertile soil for your imagination to
Mm.
grow things. And I think
Mhm.
imagination, I've been hearing over and over again this last week that imagination is our connection to the divine.
Mm.
And just from different people that I listen to, different channels and different kind of esoteric texts. And I was thinking about how imagination is natural. Like
Mm.
creative genius is natural.
Yeah.
All we need to do is like give it the right soil and the seeds will start to do things.
Mhm.
So instead of sort of constructing our idea of like, what is the seed that I'm here to do? You
Mm.
sort of watch yourself behave. You sort of let
Mm.
yourself plant seeds just by existing and following your instincts and having a good time and going towards your interests. And if
Yeah.
you have the right soil, something does just grow, like
Hmm.
at least in the world of the people that I work with. And so just kind of connect this to what you were saying around this idea of the disciplined, serious artist and the sort of easeful, expansive, weightless spiritual practitioner. I think that because we're living in this 3D, let's call it, I don't know, density, physicality with
Hmm.
gravity,
Hmm.
we have to be all those things at the same
Yeah.
time.
Right.
And the moment we pit them against each other, we create two things that are supposed to actually are our creative fuel. That tension between
Mm-hmm.
them is the creative project of being alive.
Mm-hmm.
And we waste or drain ourselves by causing two parts of us that are very true and that are very us to get into a battle, meanwhile missing all the opportunities to use that tension to create something.
Yeah. 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 I am thinking now about something you said a moment ago about the nervous system. And I've been wondering too in my own creative process how much of frustration that I experience when I'm trying to create something is a result of me essentially overriding my body being tired. You know, my mind being dulled. Like, I just want to read a novel right now. Like, I don't want to work on this anymore. I just want to put it away. Right. And I think so much of, let's just say, hustle culture that is really embedded within the school culture that we all have to kind of survive, right? As children, many of us listening to this, um, is about training ourselves to override some of these feelings, you know? Um, yeah, in this moment, Xenia, I kind of feel like sharing with you that I'm in the middle of a specific creation which came in super hot and super exciting to me, and I'm just like, yes, I'm gonna make this. But then the process of chiseling it, I realized there's a part of me that puts a timeline that actually creates some sort of pressure that makes the creation not very organic, you know. So it's really refreshing for me to hear about this connection you were drawing between cosmology and how our cosmology creates the soil upon which our imagination can grow.
Mm.
Because I do think that, like for example, in my lived experience, right? I do hold this part of my cosmology is I believe that creations have their own spirit. And
Mm.
because they have their own spirit, they have their own timing, right? So if I try to impose a timeline that doesn't isn't in resonance or isn't in conversation with the spirit of that creation, of course it's hard. Of course it feels hard, right? Because it doesn't want to be put in that box, which sometimes we think we need to in order for us not to um in order for us to be able to do anything in the world, right? Which is, it's so interesting because again, that is very much like a cult way of thinking, that we have to have this like 5-year plan in order for that to happen, right?
Yeah, I think that I love what you're saying because this is the push and pull. So I have another offering that I do called Imaginal Temple, which is like a
Mhm.
creative container to plant the seeds. Like once the cosmology is there, you plant the seeds inside Imaginal Temple. And
Mhm.
something I think almost everyone I know reckons with is respecting the spirit of their creation and their
Mhm.
body at the same time, which is like two
Mhm.
skills you're not given
Nope.
as in your education at all, like sort of how do you
Nope.
flow with the energy of something? How do you co-create instead of thinking of yourself as sort of alone dragging this project up a hill? And
Yeah.
how do you take care of your body? All skills that we were under nurtured
Yeah.
in. And I think that it's super interesting because first of all, like the culty part of this is that like everyone I know has some voice in their head that is then really mean and rude and really lacking in compassion of when that feeling happens.
Mm,
And if your nervous system can't handle like freedom
mhm,
because it doesn't feel safe to you to rest, or it doesn't feel safe to you to trust a co-creation, then even when you have agency or the privilege of working the way you want to, you will try to imprison yourself in sort of the collective nervous system or the cult of the culture you're in, just because there is no other path yet created
mm,
just yet.
mhm,
And what I do find is that with the nervous system and creativity, when you kind of go off the path you were given, you and your nervous system are sort of walking in the dark together. Think of like the electricity that runs through you and
mhm,
trying to get the electricity to flow a different way,
mm.
you know? And so even 1% in a different way is like a massive world opening, even if how that manifests is something that's like completely private to you. You know, it's just
Yeah.
literally you nicer to yourself when you're
Mhm,
tired. But that's massive.
mhm,
From
mhm.
like a sort of energetic rebellion standpoint, that's a huge, huge accomplishment.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just hope part of the other thing I hope to create is a dialogue around those kinds of celebrations.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, my favorite face of the divine is like this, what I call like the divine grandmother, which is like this voice that just says like, "Oh, you're working too hard. Just like sip this lemonade, right? You're gonna be okay." I feel like the maybe my favorite embodiment of that voice is Elizabeth Gilbert's Big Magic. Like
Mm,
that whole book is like spoken in that voice. And you know, it's easy, especially within this um, hustle culture we live in, right? And that we have to operate within, or sometimes we feel like we have to operate within, to think that that voice or that attitude is so like weak, you know, or like you will never get anything done if you talk to yourself like that. When actually, that's what keeps you going, right? A lot of the times, like when we look at creators, and I would say also healers, right, who have been doing this for a very long time and manages to create a body of work that they're really proud of and that can really nourish the people who interact with that body of work, there is something to their ability to stay in the game, right? And
mm.
I think that I've been thinking a lot about how our ability to stay in the game isn't about strength, really. Isn't really, I mean, definitely not about rigidity, right? It's not about loudness. It has a lot to do with giving yourself a lot of space actually to breathe, right? So that you can continue living. Like, how can something be alive if it doesn't breathe, you know?
You know, I love that you're asking me this now because, like I said earlier, I'm watching my frequency change. Like everything I make teaches me what the next thing is. And I don't know if I could honestly say that until about 2 months ago, I think that in really like covert ways, I was living into hustle culture, but it was
Mm,
very much small, tiny bursts of it that probably only I would perceive because I have actually quite a lot of time freedom compared to most people. And
mm,
I am in the precipice of really understanding when my nervous system is so addicted to stress because stress helps prevent me from seeing clearly things that need to change,
yeah.
what I need to do, what I really want, or any kind of change that I would be afraid of making. It makes me
Mm,
too clear when I'm not stressed out. And so it
mhm,
protects me from having to do anything or know anything that I'm not ready to know.
yeah.
And as time has been unwinding and I'm watching how strange it is for me to not fill up all my time, be constantly stressed out by different things pulling on me, I realized that this experience is completely foreign to me, as if I've been like rebirthed into a new life or into a new timeline.
Mm-hmm.
And um it the temptation to feel guilty or to think about my privilege or to think like this is too much for you to have. You should give something away. Right now, you've never had this much space in your life. There must be something wrong. This doesn't feel safe. It's like right on the edge of it really touching me. Like I can feel it and
Yeah.
see it, but it's not, I'm not really absorbing it. And I think
Mm.
that this is part of the cult in culture, especially in New York, especially in the creative world, especially in the entrepreneurial world,
Mm.
that is so hard because in hardship there is kinship. In hardship, kinship is easy to turn towards, and that's sad. It's a
Yeah.
little bit. It's also easy to turn towards enjoy. Unfortunately, our recent history has shown us much more examples of turning towards each other in times because we had
Yeah.
to.
Yeah.
And learning how to relate to spaces and even the people closest to me when I really don't feel this nagging need to prove myself to myself anymore, which is what drove me to what I was able to do all this
Yeah.
time. It's so
Yeah.
incredibly driven to show myself that the path I took made sense.
Mm.
Like it was
Mm-hmm.
okay. You said no to all these other paths and you chose this one. And we have to show ourselves that. And
Yeah.
I'm finally at this exhale. And what's really interesting about it is that I feel like once you get into that co-creative rhythm with the universe and with these projects or the spirit of an offering, that is actually the thing that for me that allowed me to be like, oh, I don't need to push this whole thing by myself.
Mm.
I need to like be much more like nature where there's a season of something becoming ripe and something becoming fallow and resting before something else
Yeah.
emerges. And
Yeah.
that's totally new
Mm-hmm.
for me. I'm like
Mm-hmm.
even sometimes embarrassed to say it.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think as you're speaking, I'm feeling into my own experience as an immigrant in the United States. And also, I grew up in Indonesia, which wasn't really my ancestral homeland either. So, this experience of like not really being of the place that you are living in. And it is wild to me, Xenia, to think about what my body had to go through in the process of immigrating to the US.
Mm,
The constant stress of like, am I going to be able to get a visa to continue living here? How do I talk to my employer so that I can get my green card? And I remember when I finally got my green card, it was like something popped within me. It was so shocking to me to like not live with that feeling anymore. Like I remember for about 2 months waking up every morning and being like, wait, what? I don't have to worry about this anymore. And it was at that point, it had become um, the kind of anxiety that's so low in the mix that it's almost like room noise. It's like when you listen to music, right? Especially ones that are recorded in a studio with a band, you almost can't even pick up that there is this really subtle noise until, right, the noise of the room itself, until like an engineer would cut it out or something like that. Like you would be shocked. You'd be like, wait, what? Suddenly it's just gone. And I think for a lot of us, hustle culture, even when we've extracted ourselves from the machines, right, that perpetuate the most horrendous version of hustle culture, it still lives in so many different crevices of our nervous systems.
yeah, totally. That's so such a beautiful metaphor to understand how that feels to have something running in the background of your
Yeah.
nervous system at all times, what you shared.
Hmm.
And it's reminding me of this thing I was thinking about today, which was, I think about capitalism as sort of an imagination monopoly. That's like a phrase
Mm.
I was playing with a lot last year, imagination monopolies. And when you think about it, it's everything is a mythology, right? So, what is the
Mhm.
mythology of capitalism? It is
Mm.
that your value is what you produce, what you create, how you get people to value your labor or
Mm.
intellectual property
Mhm.
monetarily,
Yeah.
and what consumer experiences you can unlock or access. That's
Yeah.
the video game of
Mhm.
capitalism. That's
Yeah.
how we measure everything. And
Yeah.
we often think about how it's so cruelly exploitative of nature, of animals, um, of especially the most marginalized people who have their physical bodies and lands threatened.
Mm.
But it's also exploitative of the person at the cushy office job who has to erase all sense of their identity and change their language, change what they wear, change their relationships, change their identity while they're in that space. And
Mhm.
it's also oddly exploitative of the person who thinks they're winning capitalism
Mm.
because their bottomless scarcity mindset is causing them to think that they will escape the uncertainty of death or the desire to be loved and truly known by amassing more and more and more because that person has to completely sacrifice their connection to
Yeah.
all of creation, which to me is like really what abundance is. Like that
Mm.
feeling that you can connect to the spirit of that thing that wants to be created, to the
Yeah.
land that you're on, to another timeline, to a group of people, to another culture. That feeling of connectivity is an access point into everything. Now you have everything
Mm.
because you're
Mhm.
connected.
Mhm.
And I was thinking this morning that, like, in what hustle culture does, what capitalism's imagination does, is it divorces us from a relational
Mm.
reality.
Mhm. Mhm.
And in and it also just creates a bottom line assumption that nothing is valuable innately. It all has to demonstrate or prove its value. And so, of
Yeah.
course, when we become, when we're trying to create our art or trying to put something out in the world, everything we've been taught is showing us this is how you know that this matters.
Mhm.
It's metrics
Yeah.
and institutions
Yeah.
saying that you're okay. And it's weird choosing to incarnate during this bridge time where the new world's not quite built yet. The old one is for sure crumbling. I feel that in my bones. I
Mm.
see it.
Mhm.
And we all still have to exist. You know, we
Yep.
still have to exist. And
Yep.
so the the kind of interesting part of this time is that it almost reminds me of like sort of historically bohemian times where people
Mm.
have to kind of like have these one-off conversations and figure out what the theater of life could look like if we just tried something else. And everybody
Mm.
sort of being the fool
Mhm.
for
Mhm.
a while and just being like, this is all an experiment. Some of
Yeah.
this may work, but like, what else do we really have a choice?
Yeah.
Um, Should we just do something we know for sure doesn't work, or should we just kind of sit here waiting for the world to change, you
Yeah.
know? And so
Right.
yeah, those are the options. And so why not consider the possibility that if we're all sort of don't know what we're doing in this new landscape trying to bridge two worlds, that we might as
Mm.
well all be part of the web,
Yeah.
we might as well all weave it together.
Yeah. Mm. Which goes back to the spider imagery that you were talking about earlier. Yeah.
Yeah.
um, I want to talk about. I think this is a great segue, Xenia, into human design because, first of all, I'm curious to hear about your relationship with human design as much as you want to share. Um, and also, I think you had brought up this idea of the circuitry in human design, the individual, tribe, and collective um, circuits in human design. And yeah, maybe start with your relationship with human design. I know we can talk about the circuits. Mhm.
Okay. So my relationship with this, actually, this is my relationship with everything. When something feels deeply true to me in my bones when I look at it, so like the
Mm,
chart of human design and the body of knowledge,
mm,
I think what it is unlocking is a way to understand myself outside of normative social constructs. Because when I look at my chart, I'm like, that's me. And when I've seen so many different ones, I can feel the truth of the resonance of all the charts with the energies and the beings I've met.
mhm,
However, I think that we get into a dangerous place when we're trying to use the linear mind to understand the greatest mysteries of life. And some people interact with these modalities in order to do just that, to sort of
mm,
um, take the imagination of capitalism and sort of just plug it into the content of human design, for example. And so I've kind of stepped away from exclusively reading charts because I need someone to be really familiar with my perspective or my work before I feel comfortable or safe then talking to them about their chart.
mhm.
And safety more for them than me, really. And
Yeah.
that I've
I'm laughing because I'm getting this imagery of like someone taking the human design pill and like getting really sick because they took it at the wrong time. So you're like, let me write out the instructions for you.
wrong dose, wrong dose. But it's because like when I see people using any modality as a reason to stay exactly the same
Hmm.
and or to limit themselves in terms of what they're allowed to try or do or be interested in. So basically to override their internal unfolding and their own voice. I
Hmm.
get very nervous
Hmm.
about that. At the same time, there are parts of the chart that are just so deep and true
Hmm.
that I will probably always have a place in my psyche for this modality because it really builds compassion
Yeah.
for ourselves and other people.
Hmm. Hmm. I love that. Yeah. Um, and I think the circuit is a very interesting part of human design because I remember at least when I was training human design with my teachers, John and Amy from Human Design Collective, it was introduced kind of in the middle of our studies. So before we actually studied the individual gates. So I remember just kind of being lost, Xenia. So I wonder if that's also why I think you mentioned, a lot of people, not a lot of people talk about the circuits. I think part of it is probably because people who studied it at some point, they're like, oh no, I'm lost. But I do think that even just hearing about it, right? So the three types of circuits are individual, collective, and tribal are so there's something even in just those words, right? That I think really opens up the imagination and opens up our perception and awareness as well. So I'm curious to hear you talk more about how you understand the circuits and how you understand this idea of how some processes are individual, other processes are collective and tribal. And maybe, I'm also aware that listeners who are tuning into our conversation who are not studying human design may not understand the difference between the collective and the tribal. And so, yeah, anything that you want to share around that. Mhm.
Sure. So, when you look at a human design chart, you see all these different lines, and those lines are where you are consistently running your energy. They're called channels. And
Mhm.
all of those lines have a family that they belong to. And those families are individual, collective, and tribal.
Mhm.
Um, and there's also one called integration, but primarily I focus on the three that we named. And I think of them as what is the umbrella flavor of your energy.
Mm. Mhm.
So with tribal, you have people that care a lot about their defined groups. So your family, your neighborhood, your sports team, something that's localized into an
Mm.
actual group of people. And these people maintain systems of support.
Mm.
They maintain really tangible forms of support, putting
Mhm.
food on the table,
Yeah.
calling up your neighbor, developing trust in real time because you are really invested in each other as a community or as a group.
Mm.
And then collective energy is much more abstract. Collective energy is really where you get people who are looking into mythology, people who are looking at mathematics and patterns, because they're trying to understand something connective that literally applies to anybody. So
Mm.
they're trying to see patterns, rules, stories, fractals that explain the human experience.
Mm.
And then and actually, I just looked up the keynotes for these right before. And keynotes in human design is just kind of like a shortcut way to better understand something. And
Mhm.
so for tribal people, their master keynote is support.
Mm.
And for collective people, their master keynote is sharing, which I think
Mhm.
is, really, really interesting.
Mhm.
And then you have individual energy, which I have, kind of a lot of. And this is energy that's come in to introduce something that does not yet exist into the
Mm.
collective pot of possibility and energy. And
Mhm.
the reason I even bring up circuitry in readings usually is when I see someone has a lot of individual energy, the
Mm.
cadence of how things come through for them tends to be very, very unpredictable,
Yep.
like all at once, then nothing, stop, go. And I share it with people so that they understand like that there's nothing wrong with the way they're experiencing their
Mm.
creativity,
Mhm.
that they're here to introduce a potential mutation is what we call it in human design, which is essentially the same as when animals mutate, right? Like there's a first chameleon that changes colors before all the other ones do.
Yeah.
And it has to kind of be in its own world, just experiencing something very psychedelic and strange
Yeah.
because it's trying to be timed when the collective could potentially benefit from a
Mm.
diverse field of
Mhm.
ways of being and
Yeah.
existing. So
Yeah.
their contribution is really diversity to help the species continue to adapt. And
Mm.
their keynote is empowerment.
Mm. Mhm.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I think like overall, we all tend to have this like unconscious hierarchy of what we prefer, right? We're like,
Mhm.
I love scientists, or like, I really respect people who are just there for their families. Like, or like, I can't believe people are so traditional. Like, how bored, like, we all do this because we choose what we relate to and we want to,
Yeah.
be validated in how we are. So we can
Mhm.
tend to want to like rationalize why something's better than another. And then what
Yeah.
human design does is it says like we are all needed. So why don't you just like appreciate the way someone
Yeah.
else is built
Yeah.
and then appreciate the way you're built and
Mm.
be who you are.
Yeah. Yeah. So that you can be part of the web again.
Yes.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah. Um yeah, I'm really, as you're speaking, thinking about my own design and thinking about how my only defined channel is collective, but a lot of my activations are individual. And so
Hmm.
I move through this really interesting process of my knowing my inspiration um, tends to be very, like, it's very erratic. It has its own timing, it has its own intelligence, and it does whatever it wants when it wants to. And it's so frustrating because I can't explain it to other people. Um, it just makes me crazy. Like, I tend to be good with my words, but if I try to explain my knowing to other people, it falls flat because it's just my own knowing. right? And it's over time I've learned that, there's no such thing as mastery or perfection with these things, right? You keep learning as you go, but what I found is over time, when I start to find myself getting frustrated trying to explain something to another person, trying to share from my collective channel, right? Something that's actually very individual, there is, I think human design is helpful because it gives you awareness.
Mm.
And sometimes when I snap out of it, I'm like, oh, actually, that knowing was just purely individual for me. I see this timeline, this possibility, this future, and it's not my partner's fault that they can't see it. It's not my mentor's fault or my student's fault that they can't see it because that knowing was just for me to be able to have enough confidence to lead the collective into that space, right? But and sometimes I even think about the collective because the collective circuits, my collective channel feels very mysterious to me sometimes. Like it kind of feels like the collective is more about giving ourselves permission to contribute our perspective to the chorus. But you really don't get to control what happens once the the note is played, right? Like once the note is played, you don't know if it's going to mess up the whole symphony or if it's going to lead the symphony into like a really nice glowing place, right? You just never really know. Like there's kind of a mystery aspect, I think, to the collective that's maybe also reflective of like where we're at, in our
Yeah.
evolution. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's interesting because I do kind of feel like when I think about collective energy, I really do think about like the storytellers around the campfires, the mythologists, and the mathematicians doing their research. And so, in a weird way, I feel like they are trying to undo a sense of mystery by being like, there must be a pattern here. Like, surely it
Mm-hmm.
must exist. But I think what you're right, like, this is really interesting what you're bringing up, this like the old measurements aren't working. The
Mm-hmm.
old formulas aren't working. The myths haven't been written yet. So like what are we really trying to what is the story we're trying to tell? We haven't even had the experience yet. Like we're about to live into it.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if that will feel different for you in like 10 to 20 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
Because our ideas of I do think right now our ideas of collectivism and tribalism are sort of merged
Mm-hmm.
into one in the way we
Mm-hmm.
talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
People talk a lot about being part of the collective as sort of giving away their individual perspectives or um, honoring their individual capacities or needs to do what is needed for the whole. And, as an Aquarius rising, I just think it's really cool that Aquarius is the sign of the collective and the rebel. I've been
Mm-hmm.
thinking about that like my whole since I learned about Aquarius, because I would just would it didn't make any sense to me when I was sort of
Mm-hmm.
living in the world of the merged collective tribal idea. I was like, but how can I be a rebel and also care about the collective? It doesn't,
Mm-hmm.
how does that make sense? And
Mm-hmm.
I've come to realize over time that when we are what we are, the whole is served
Mm-hmm.
because something much bigger than any single one of us put us here.
Yeah.
So who are we to say that we can wrap our heads around who we should or should not be?
Mm.
Try to live into that mental picture. That's kind of
Yeah.
like a weird ego trick. Like, well, I know what my value is. But like we don't
Mm-hmm.
even know why we exist.
Yeah.
Like we're just here. It's so strange. Well, when you sort of like look at the scientific probability that we would all exist and everything would be organized like this, it's
Mm-hmm.
just, kind of a profound miracle, which is to say that like being who we are we must be here for a reason to serve some sort of role in the
Mm.
bigger picture.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's beautiful. I had a question that popped into my head as you were speaking, which is I'm curious to hear um, your thoughts about when our cosmology clashes with others. Because I feel like this happens all the time, right? We live in a world where I would argue that all of us actually have our own cosmology,
Yeah.
because we have such unique individual experiences. And I feel that people like you and I are able to come together, collaborate, because there is resonance in our cosmologies, right? But there's also plenty of people that I do not have any resonance with in terms of their cosmology. Like they would just say something and I'm like, what? Doesn't make sense to me. Yeah, as someone who thinks about this a lot, Xenia, what have you learned about the idea of or the experience of clashing cosmologies?
Well, I had no choice but to learn about this because I was born into an extremely conservative family with very different perspective than me on
Mhm,
literally the nature of reality. I actually
mhm,
have to say something so specific, which is that so like both of my parents are super devout Catholics and my
mhm,
mother is quite literal
mhm, mhm.
in her interpretation of everything. I might have
Yeah.
said this to you, but she's the kind of person who, if she reads a recipe that she needs a certain brand of something, she'll go buy that brand of that thing because the instructions
Mm,
told her to do that.
right.
But she's my dad's recently gotten in, just came across Joe Dispenza's book, Becoming Supernatural.
Mm.
And my mother saw it and was kind of like, I kind of like the way this person is writing. I'm kind of interested in this. And my dad said to her, like, that's against your religion, even though he bought the book. Um, and my the bigger story around this is that like I have never doubted once in my life that my mother has only ever wanted to keep me safe, protect me, and take care of me. And
Mm,
because I've had this lived experience of someone not understanding me at all, not understanding my worldview at all, and me sort of at times like dismissing and sort of disrespecting her worldview too,
mm,
like that was my part to play in it. I saw that loving each other and respecting each other and having the same cosmology are not the same thing. Um, Respecting people's perspectives and their right to have a perspective is very different than needing everyone to understand you as a prerequisite for connection. And because
mhm,
my life just set me up in this way, where it was like, you're going to be born to this person, they're going to have this way of being, and you're going to have this way of being.
mm.
I really feel like we passed the test of learning to love each other with flying colors. And I have rules around what kind of media I will listen to. But also, like when my mom buys me religious books or my parents give me prayer cards, I take them because I
Mm,
know where that's coming from.
yeah, right, right.
So I think it depends on the intentions of the clash, the
Mm,
investment or importance of the relationship. And then on the flip side,
mm.
I would say when two people don't resonate, maybe it doesn't need to be such a big deal or so personal.
Yeah, yeah,
Maybe they're more like
definitely.
ships in the night that pass each other.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot about timing as well. And I think what can be so challenging, especially with family members, is again, we have bought into this very cultish idea in our culture that like family's supposed to stick together. When, if you think about it in terms of even like astrology, right? If you think about celestial bodies, like they're not in conjunction all the time. Like we're
Yeah.
always having these cycles with one another, right? Like there are times when we are really far apart, maybe physically, but maybe we're really close emotionally. There are times when maybe we are living together, but we do not see eye to eye emotionally. And um, I think giving ourselves space to have all those experiences is really important, again, for the relationship to be able to breathe, right? And um, there was something you said earlier that I wanted to respond to as well that came up for me, which is around, let me see if I can remember. Oh, yeah, the idea of, when your family gave you like prayer cards or like religious books. And it makes me reflect on my own experience with that. And I think um, I've also learned that the the wounds and the pain of not being seen has its own timeline in terms of healing itself,
Mm.
and there are obviously things we can do, like clarify what our beliefs are, right? That can be really healing, or it can really accelerate that process of healing. But I think ultimately, um, some of those relational wounds of not feeling seen or not feeling validated, especially by people who we depend on for our survival as we were children, right? And as we were infants, um, yeah, they just take their own time, and then one day you wake up and you're like, okay, give me the books, give me the cards, thank you.
Yeah, I feel like there is a real sense of trying to walk as gently as they can with my parents' side, which makes it easier for me to say yes. I don't feel
Mhm,
forced or coerced. And I
mhm,
think because of that, I can receive it. But I think it'd be a
mm,
different story
mhm.
if they were inviting me into their cult, which is
Yeah,
what they're doing.
yeah. Right, right. Um, yeah. I have I have another question that I want us to explore as we're maybe beginning to wind to a close, Xenia, which is um, so you had brought up this idea of being a visionary and being misunderstood. And I want to narrow this down a little bit because I'm currently having an experience, and I imagine a lot of people who are drawn to listening to this conversation might have a similar experience of the artist who's also teaching or sharing something, right?
Mm.
And this is something that I have been really navigating in the quote unquote spiritual world, because there's a lot of people who create learning containers, but when I really feel into their energy and how they are running their energy, they're actually artists, right? And it's like, to me, at least this is my experience. I can't speak for anybody else. But if I go to like a Taylor Swift or like a Charlie XCX or a Beyonce concert, my mind is very clear that I'm just watching. I'm there to be entertained, right? I'm not trying to learn from Taylor or Charlie or Beyonce, right? Like I'm just there to like enjoy the vibes. And sometimes I think a lot of people who share their thoughts, who create offerings, are also creating from that space of being the artist, being the creator. And yet, we're so used to treating our teachers or people that we learn from by putting them on a pedestal, right? It's almost like it's so interesting because for me personally, I know that this is cultural. Like, this is because of the culture I grew up in. We were taught that we needed to put our teachers on a pedestal because that's how you learn. Otherwise, you can't learn, right? Um, and I've also seen people on the other end of the spectrum who like always diminishes whatever the teacher says in order to find their perspective, which to me also signals a lack of trust in oneself, right? Because you don't have to fight against someone to find your perspective. Like, for your perspective to be unique, you don't always have to be in opposition to another person, right? They
Right.
can be unique and shared at the same time. And I think some people feel so threatened by like, oh, I have to find my perspective. My perspective has to be different than my teacher, right? And I've been on both ends of this. So I guess I'm curious to hear from your perspective, because I think this is something you do so beautifully, Xenia, at least from my perspective. And also in terms of yeah, just like what you would say to creators and artists who want to share frameworks that's helped them.
Yeah, I'm so glad that we're talking about this because I had learned a long time ago. I think I was maybe even like 20 when I said, if I can't figure out what to do with my life, the only regular job I could ever have is I would teach at like an elementary school or something. I could be a teacher. That's the only job I'd ever feel comfortable in. And
Mm,
I think the reason that I never actually thought of myself as a teacher for a pretty long time is because I had a really specific academic idea of what you had to do to become
mm,
a teacher or facilitator and what that
mhm,
even meant. Like, what does that identity mean? And a lot of that was constructed through the imagination of capitalism holding hands with academia. And the other thing I'll say is that there's a reason why artistic culture um, is so infused with the energy of struggle. I think that's very on
mm,
purpose. I think
mhm,
that uh, power structures know that the artistic lens is the lens to freedom, like actual energetic, true, non dogmatic liberation and freedom, because the artist asks why.
mm,
The artist isn't always here to show us what we know. The
mm,
artist is here to explore the edges of what we might know or what we could know
mm.
or what we're now discovering together in real time. And
Yeah.
so when I started to think about the teacher as the person who facilitates a space for people to examine what's possible, for something to unfold within in them organically, and to learn tools, skills, and frameworks that could help them
Mhm,
rearrange their ideas differently than they were before, just to
mhm,
open new pathways for them. Then I became really comfortable
mhm,
thinking about myself as a facilitator or a teacher because
mhm.
that's something I do very naturally for myself.
Yeah.
So when I think about this idea of hierarchy or pedestaling or trying to organize groups of people into teacher and student, I think it's just so uncomfortable because it's the same thing we've been talking about, which is like the old ways aren't really true anymore and the new ways
Mhm.
not fully landed into the nervous system yet.
Yeah.
All like sort of renegotiating in real time what we think about our relationship to a body of work, to a modality, or to a teacher. Do we want to receive things energetically? Are we up for that?
Mm,
Do
mhm.
we want to imagine ourselves on the teaching side as transmitters moving energy through the field, whether on an unconscious level, whether people really realize that's happening or not?
Mm,
How much of that needs to be explained before you get into the container? How much of it do you just trust the way that like life unfolds in mysterious ways and things happen always on levels that we're not perceiving?
yeah.
That I can't answer, but
Mhm,
I think most people I know are holding a cosmology that they want to share. And so I would encourage thinking of teaching also like an art,
mm,
because I think that helps us be more honest and creative in how we bring what we want to
mm.
other people.
Yeah. It's beautiful. Yeah. Teaching as an art. Yeah, I also think about how, for example, when I go to a museum and I interact with an art, my relationship to it is very different than, say, if I were reading a book, right? Like a self help book where I'm like, I have to do all the steps in order to be successful or whatever, right? Um, and there's, I'm sure there's like a neuroscience really cool reason for this, but I feel like my brain orients to looking at art differently because I'm just allowing the art to exist. I'm just allowing the art to, if it wants to influence me, wonderful. If it doesn't, then that's fine, right? Like I don't put a lot of pressure on it, and similarly, like if I just flick through Spotify, there's always songs that I love and there's always songs that I don't. And I'm always like, okay, Cool. And I think that I like this. I like what you were just saying about teaching us art because I do think that part of why a lot of artists can create works that people can interact with in that way is there's a willingness to completely go into the specificity of their vision, and really own it, rather than um, this is something that I see in myself. So I'm really just going to speak from the I here, where I think a lot of people who get into the profession of teaching does so because they want to convince other people, or they're like, there's a better way to do this. Like, I want to correct something. And I think when we come from that space of correction, then there's, yeah, more tension there, and it kind of has, and I think there's an art to that too, right? Because sometimes that's where transformation happens from that place of tension. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that it's also interesting that there's all this kind of pop science coming out about how like states of play and creativity are so conducive to learning, and yet
Mm,
separated neurologically in our experience through the structures of our education.
yeah.
And yeah, I do think that are parts of what I want to say because I feel like they are missing in the world. And so that
Mhm.
feels a little bit corrective to me sometimes, like this should be here. I'll just put it here. Um, but I think that my need to coerce people has actually gone down ever since I started realizing that it's so much more of our frequencies working together. And we don't really need to
Mm,
work as hard as we think we
yeah.
need to learn from each other. Like we're doing it all the time.
Yeah. True.
Um, yeah, and that helped me relax. And I think it makes my me more honest when I don't feel the need to sort of bring people into my cult.
Hmm. Totally. Totally. Um, this has just been such a beautiful conversation, Xenia. Thank you so much. I'm curious if you have any final thing you want to talk about before I have you, talk more about Create Your Cosmology and how people can find your work.
You know, I just want to say that I have never felt more like it was possible to like walk into a new reality that I have felt the last 3 or 4 months. And I just wanted to say that in case anyone else who is listening either feels really tired of things and
Uh,
feels like things take really long and or is also
mm,
feeling how I'm feeling.
mm-hmm.
It's just a really interesting time to be
Yeah.
alive. And so I just want to honor that experience. And I just
Yeah.
want to thank you because you ask the most beautiful questions and you have the most surprising insights. And it's always such a deep pleasure to be in conversation with you.
Oh, I feel the same way. Um, so give us the details, Senia, about Create Your Cosmology.
I've
Give
been
us the
seeing,
details. When do we start? And yeah, and how can people learn more about it? I know you also just gave access to, I think, the first module, right, or something like that. Yeah.
yeah, so I've been very cryptic about this. So this is the first time I won't be this round. So we are going to be launching this in a hybrid way. So what I've
Mm,
done is I've broken down the recordings that I
mm,
already did into
mhm.
much smaller bite-sized pieces because they're a lot to sit with.
They're dense,
Yeah,
but
they're super
amazingly dense. Yes.
super dense. And so we wanted to make it a little bit more bite-sized in the way
Mm,
people pace themselves and then
mhm,
we have 5 live meetings where we're going to integrate what people have been learning so they have time to ask questions instead of
mm.
just receiving information. And
Yeah.
we are going to start September 24th.
Mm.
And we also are going to have you as a guest lecturer in the
Yay!
course
I'm so excited.
because I really wanted to bring your understanding of both systems and the world of analytical thinking and the way you blend it with the mystery. And so we will be announcing more details about that, but that's why I thought of you is because you're somebody who's really fluent in those different ways of thinking and
Mm,
allows them to exist together.
mm,
And we also have the a bonus 11/11 ceremony that is going to be all about just like really creating magic with the transformations and transitions that have been taking place. So
mm,
the the whole journey is designed to activate things that want to be broken up, move emotional things that want to shift, and also unearth your own truths that have been like hiding there in plain sight. And
mm,
we go through a lot of exercises. We call it a belief map and consciousness map to let you see what kinds of ideas that you're working with so you can start to play with organizing them.
mm.
So I'm going to be opening up registration this weekend. I know that this recording will come out after this weekend, but I'll be opening it up soon. And yeah, what I designed was actually instead of giving people a preview into a first module, I created a preview environment of what it
Mm,
feels like to be in the course and the
mm.
different rabbit holes that you fall into. And so that's available to anyone who signs up for the wait list. And yeah, I'm really excited about this round. I feel like it's going to be its own universe.
Yeah, I'm excited too. And I'm really excited for everybody who is drawn to this container. I think it's a much, much needed offering. And um, what I appreciate so much, Xenia, is you have this really beautiful, gentle, and um, you're like someone who is like scary smart, but you have a way of communicating your ideas and organizing your ideas in a way that feels so gentle and like actually opens up my curiosity, which I think is incredible. Like I feel that being around you has allowed me to be more nerdy and more of this weird being that I am. So I'm excited for others to also experience your magic. Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, so much. That is so nice to receive. And yeah, if we can be friendly towards the spirit that we already are, I
Mm,
feel like we can we're doing a pretty good job. I feel like we could pretty much
yeah.
do anything from that
Yeah.
place. So I'm
Yeah.
really grateful to receive your experience. And yeah, I hope some people folks will join us. And thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're so welcome. Thank you for being here. Would you also want to share your how people can find you on Instagram, Substack, and all of that?
Yeah, I mean, if people are interested in just getting to know the work, they can go
Hmm.
to at Myths of Creation on Instagram. There's a lot of different expressions there. And I also have a Substack called Garden of the Imaginal at gardenoftheimaginal.com where you can
Hmm.
get a feel for my style and my voice and my perspective.
Amazing. Okay. Thank you, Xenia.
Thank you.